30-second intro. New York City. A Saturday night in October, the Grand Meridian Ballroom. 200 guests. Crystal chandeliers. Nathan raised the small package in front of the microphone. Eyes cold. Voice cutting across the entire room. Is this a joke? 7 months pregnant. And this is the best you could do, something that looks like it came from a yard sale. The watch slipped from the box and hit the marble floor. Crack. The ballroom erupted into laughter. At the far end of the room, Claire stood completely still, both hands pressed against her 7-month belly, eyes fixed on her husband. No tears, no trembling, just something inside her that had just made up its mind. He didn't know that was her father's only watch, the pan she lost when she was 9 years old. He also didn't know that the wife he had just humiliated was carrying a secret worth $47 billion. And tonight was the last night she planned to keep it. This is the story of something truly priceless that money could never buy. Follow now so you don't miss a single moment of what happens next. Picture a Saturday night in October in Manhattan. Picture the Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom on the 14th floor, where crystal chandeliers cast everything in warm gold light, where a string quartet plays just loudly enough to feel elegant without interrupting conversation, where 200 guests an evening, where hold champagne flutes and debate market projections and exchange business cards with the practiced ease of people who have been performing success for so long they have forgotten it is a performance. Picture a man at the center of it all. His name is Nathan Hartwell. He is 35 years old tonight. He is the founder and chief executive of a financial technology company that went public 3 months ago and has been climbing steadily ever since. He has spent 6 weeks planning this party, the venue, the guest list, the lighting. The moment he will step to the microphone and announce the expansion of his company into London and Dubai. He has imagined this night many times. He knows exactly how it is supposed to feel. He is holding a champagne glass in one hand and a microphone in the other. And he is laughing. Not the laugh of a man who has heard something genuinely funny. The other kind. The laugh that needs an audience. The laugh that grows louder the more people join it. And across the ballroom, near the main entrance, standing alone beside a pillar, is a woman in a navy maternity dress. Her name is Claire Hartwell. She is 7 months pregnant. She drove herself to this party because Nathan left 2 hours early to manage the setup and did not offer to wait for her. She is holding a small package wrapped in brown paper with a cotton ribbon, and she is watching her husband laugh. And she already knows, somewhere beneath her ribs, that the night is going to end badly. She does not yet know how badly. She does not yet know what the next 4 hours will cost both of them. It starts with a woman named Victoria Blake suggesting, in a voice designed to carry, that Nathan open his gifts for the room. You always do it at these things, Victoria says, her hand resting lightly on Nathan's forearm in a way that has become familiar over the course of the evening. People love it. Don't be shy. Nathan agrees immediately. The gifts are extraordinary. A $40,000 watch in a presentation box with the price tag still visible. Super Bowl tickets in a leather portfolio. A piece of modern art from a gallery that requires a membership account to purchase from. Each one draws appreciative applause and Nathan's practiced smile, which gets wider with every box he opens. When he reaches Claire's packaged brown paper, cotton ribbon, small, unremarkable beside everything surrounding it, the energy in the room shifts. Someone near the back laughs first. Just a sound, not even a word, just the sound of 200 people suddenly paying attention to the same thing at the same time. Nathan stares at the package. He looks up at Claire across the room, and something happens in his face that Claire has never seen before. Something that has nothing to do with her at all. Something that is entirely about the 200 people watching him and what he needs from them in this moment. He raises the package above his head. Is this a joke? His voice carries over the microphone to every corner of the ballroom. 7 months pregnant, and this is what you bring me. Something that looks like it came out of a yard sale. A watch falls from the box. It hits the marble floor. The sound it makes is sharper than it should be, cleaner, final, and the room laughs. 200 people, laughing. Some of them are filming on their phones. Some of them are looking away with the discomfort of people who know they are witnessing something wrong, but lack the courage to interrupt it. Most of them are simply laughing, feeding the moment, giving Nathan exactly what he asked for without being asked. Victoria Blake stands 3 feet from Nathan with a quiet smile arranged carefully on her face. And Claire Hartwell, 7 months pregnant, stands near the entrance of a ballroom full of strangers, with her hands going instinctively to her stomach. The baby kicks. First time all evening, and something in Claire that has been bending quietly for months stops bending. Not breaking, just stopping. Stay with me. Because before we get to what Claire does next, before we get to what walks through those ballroom doors, 30 seconds later, you need to understand who Claire Hartwell actually is. Because the woman standing near that pillar in the navy dress, she is about to become the most powerful person in the room. And not one single person in that ballroom has any idea. 18 months before the party, Claire Reynolds was exactly what she appeared to be. She drove a 10-year-old Volvo wagon that she serviced herself at a shop on Amsterdam Avenue where the owner had known her for 6 years and always told her she was the most reliable customer he had. She brought lunch from home 5 days a week in a canvas bag she had owned since graduate school. She wore her dark hair pulled back at work because, she always said, fussing over appearance was time stolen from the work itself. She spent her days at a small but well-regarded auction house on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, appraising antique timepieces and estate jewelry, cataloging the accumulated objects of lives that had ended and were now passing into new hands. She was exceptionally good at it. She understood the relationship between an object and the time it had witnessed. She understood that value and price were rarely the same thing. Nobody who worked with Claire Reynolds would have described her as remarkable, capable, certainly, pleasant, always. But remarkable, no, which was exactly how she had spent her entire adult life arranging things to appear. Here is what you need to understand about Claire's grandmother. Margaret Reynolds. Margaret never appeared in financial magazines. She never allowed photographers at her foundation events. She never permitted her name on a building while she was alive to see it placed there. She believed, with the particular conviction of someone who had been burned by visibility early in her career, that the most dangerous thing a person with significant resources could do was make those resources publicly known before they fully understood the people around them. Margaret Reynolds had spent 50 years quietly building one of the most significant private fortunes in American history, commercial real estate across 17 states, 3 private equity funds with controlling interests in industries that touched millions of American lives without anyone ever knowing the Reynolds name was involved, a foundation that had funded rural hospitals, public libraries, and scholarship programs since 1987, a private art collection that museum directors flew in from Paris and London to study. The total value of the estate, conservatively assessed by 3 independent firms, was $47 billion. Margaret had exactly 1 grandchild. Claire's parents died in a car accident on Route 9 in the Hudson Valley when Claire was 9 years old. It was a Tuesday in November, raining lightly. Ordinary in every way except that it was the last ordinary day of Claire's childhood. Margaret took Claire in that same week, quietly and without drama, the way Margaret Reynolds did everything. She enrolled Claire in the public school 3 blocks from the brownstone. Not a private academy. Not a school where the other students arrived in car services and compared vacation destinations. A public school where Claire rode the bus and bought lunch with a card like everyone else and was, to every teacher and student and parent who knew her, simply a girl who had lost her parents young and lived with her grandmother. Margaret arranged it this way deliberately. She explained it to Claire on a Sunday afternoon when Claire was 12. Sitting at the kitchen table over bowls of soup, in the direct and unhurried way that Margaret explained most important things. People who know how much money you have, Margaret said, will always look at you through that knowledge. It changes how they see your ideas. It changes why they want to be near you. It changes what they expect from you and what they think they deserve because of you. I am not telling you money is a bad thing. I am telling you that the people worth having in your life are the ones who chose you before they knew about it, because after they know, you can never be completely certain anymore. Claire was 12. She understood it intellectually in the way 12-year-olds understand important things. Imperfectly but permanently. By the time she was 31, she understood it completely. Margaret died in February. 4 months before the birthday party, she died at home, the way she had wanted to, in the brownstone where she had raised Claire. On a Tuesday morning, she was 81 years old, and she had been ready for some time, though she was not the kind of woman who said so out loud. In the weeks before she died, when her voice was thin but her mind remained absolutely clear, she took Claire's hands and repeated the thing she had been saying for 20 years. Be certain before you reveal yourself, Margaret said, not because you owe anyone secrecy, because you owe yourself certainty. There is a difference. Claire held her grandmother's hands and told her she understood. After Margaret died, William Sterling, who had served as the Reynolds family attorney for 31 years, and who loved Margaret Reynolds with the particular devotion of someone who has spent 3 decades watching a person demonstrate exactly who they are, asked Claire for 60 days of privacy while the estate completed its legal transfer. Signatures, valuations, regulatory notifications, foundation board transitions. 60 days, he said. Claire agreed without hesitation. She was grieving, and she was pregnant, and she was not yet ready for the world to rearrange itself around a number. She wanted 60 more days of being simply Claire. She had no idea what those 60 days were going to cost her. And now here is the place where I want you to pause and think about something honestly. How many of us have been in a position where we were holding back something important about ourselves, not to deceive, but to protect? How many of us have stayed quiet about something real because we were not yet sure the person in front of us had earned that knowledge? That instinct is not dishonesty. That is wisdom. Margaret Reynolds spent 50 years trying to teach her granddaughter the difference, and Claire had learned it well. The tragedy was not that she kept her secret. The tragedy was who she kept it from. Nathan Hartwell walked into Claire's auction house on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 17 months before the birthday party, carrying a set of gold cufflinks in a velvet pouch and asking to have them appraised before including them in his grandfather's estate inventory. He was charming. He was direct. He looked Claire in the eye when she asked him questions, listened to the answers without interrupting, and did not check his phone once during the 40-minute appointment. Claire noticed three things about him. He was genuinely curious about the cufflinks in a way that had nothing to do with their monetary value. He asked about the period, the craftsmanship, the likely occasion they had been made for. He wanted to understand the object, not just its price. He was working harder than he appeared to be. There was something behind the ease, some engine running at a higher speed than his relaxed posture suggested. Claire recognized it because she had spent years learning to read what objects revealed about the people who had owned them. And he looked at her like she was a person and not a fixture. That last thing was rarer than it should have been. They had coffee 3 weeks later. They dated for 4 months before either of them said anything that felt like a declaration. They moved carefully. Both of them, Nathan, because he had been hurt before, in ways he did not discuss in detail, but which Claire could read in certain silences. And Claire because she was always careful, always watching, always waiting to understand who someone truly was before she let them close. He proposed 8 months in, on a Tuesday, with a ring he had designed himself from a rough sketch he'd seen Claire doodle on a notepad during a work call they shared. He had kept the notepad. He had taken it to a jeweler and described what he'd seen and asked them to make it real. Claire thought, this man pays attention. She almost told him everything that night. She had the words ready. She had rehearsed them. She could feel the weight of the secret she'd carried for years, and she wanted to put it down, finally, with someone who had earned the right to hold it. But something Margaret shaped at the back of her mind said, wait, be certain. Not almost certain. Certain. So she waited, and she watched. What she watched, over the following months of their engagement and then their marriage, was a man she genuinely loved in a process of slow and gradual transformation that she kept finding ways to explain away. The first red flag appeared at their engagement party. It was small enough to dismiss. Nathan's posture changed when certain guests walked in, the ones with the largest companies, the most recognizable names, the most expensive cars waiting outside. His voice got slightly louder around them. His handshake became slightly firmer. His eyes tracked them across a room the way a compass tracks north. It was just ambition, Claire told herself, not corruption. Ambition was not a flaw. She had her own. The second red flag appeared 6 months into their marriage when a woman named Victoria Blake began appearing in Nathan's professional orbit. Victoria Blake. She came from Greenwich, Connecticut. The old kind of Greenwich money, the kind that doesn't announce itself with flashy cars, but with quiet country club memberships and summer homes in Maine, and the particular confidence of people who have never had to prove they belong anywhere. Victoria and Nathan had dated for 2 years in their late 20s, before Nathan's company was anything more than a promising idea and a modest bank account. The relationship had ended when Victoria's family made it understood, politely but clearly, that they did not align themselves with uncertain ventures. They liked Nathan well enough as a person. They simply required certainty. Nathan had never quite forgiven that, which was perhaps why, when Victoria reappeared in his professional life 8 months into his marriage to Claire, presenting herself as a potential investor in his company's Series B funding round, he let her back in without telling Claire she was coming. The meetings were professional, he said, just business. But Victoria's name appeared on his phone at hours that were not professional hours. And at Nathan's company holiday party, which Claire missed due to a difficult first trimester that left her exhausted by 7 o'clock most evenings, Victoria was photographed standing close enough to Nathan to be mistaken for his date. Claire saw the photographs on a professional networking site the next morning. Nathan had not mentioned Victoria would be at the party. He had not mentioned much about the party at all. Did you have a good time? Claire asked, over toast and coffee. It was fine, Nathan said, already looking at his phone. Work stuff. You didn't miss anything. She had learned, by this point, to notice the things he did not say. Here's something I want you to hold on to, because it is one of the most important distinctions in any long-term relationship. Privacy and secrecy are not the same thing. Privacy is, I need space for my thoughts, my process, my inner life. Privacy is healthy. Privacy is normal. Privacy is not a sign that something is wrong. Secrecy is different. Secrecy is, I need you not to ask questions about specific things. Secrecy is a door with a lock on it. Secrecy is a person managing your access to information they have decided you should not have. Nathan had moved, gradually and without any single dramatic moment, from the first category into the second. And Claire, who carried her own significant secret, had convinced herself that she was not in a position to demand full transparency from him without first offering it herself. That guilt kept her quiet longer than it should have. She would later recognize this as one of the costliest mistakes she made in their marriage. Not keeping her secret, but letting guilt about her secret prevent her from naming what she was watching happen in front of her. If you are reading this and any part of it sounds familiar, I want you to hear this directly. Your right to ask questions does not expire because you have your own complicated history. Your right to name what you are seeing does not require you to be without complexity yourself. Claire had a right to say, I see what is happening here. And she did not say it. Not yet. 4 days before Nathan's 35th birthday party, Claire came downstairs at 7 in the evening and found her husband in his coat with his keys in his hand, heading for the front door. I thought we were staying in tonight, she said. He turned, and his expression carried the particular quality of someone interrupted during a mental task they would prefer to continue. Oh, this is the strategy dinner for the expansion team. The core group. I told you about it. He had not told her about it. She was certain he had not told her about it, because she kept a careful mental record of the things Nathan did and did not tell her, a habit she had developed without fully acknowledging she was developing it. You should rest, he said, glancing briefly at her stomach in a way that felt clinical rather than tender. The party's in 4 days. Save your energy. And then he left. Claire stood in the kitchen for a long time after the door closed. She listened to the building's ambient sounds, the elevator, a neighbor's television, the distant percussion of the city outside their windows. She placed one hand on her stomach and felt the baby shift and settle. Then she called Rebecca Cole. Rebecca Cole was an OB/GYN at a hospital on the Upper West Side and had been Claire's closest friend since their freshman year at college. When they had been placed in adjacent rooms in a dormitory, and discovered within the first week that they were both the kind of people who preferred honest conversations to comfortable ones. Tell me I am overreacting, Claire said when Rebecca picked up. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. In 20 years of friendship, Claire had learned that Rebecca's silences were as precise as her words. Tell me what happened, Rebecca said. Claire told her. Another silence. Claire, Rebecca said carefully. When is the last time Nathan asked how you were feeling? Not the baby. You specifically. Claire opened her mouth to answer, and could not find an answer. That's what I thought, Rebecca said. You're not overreacting. That night, after she hung up, Claire went to the cedar chest at the back of their closet. The cedar chest held the small collection of objects she had kept from Margaret's brownstone after the estate inventory was completed. A set of photographs, a handwritten recipe card for Margaret's chicken soup, and a pocket watch. The watch had belonged to Claire's father, David Reynolds. It was a 1953 Hamilton pocket watch, silver-cased, with a white face and black numerals and a second hand that had once swept in perfect quarter-second intervals. David Reynolds had carried it in the breast pocket of every jacket he owned. He said it had been his father's, and his grandfather's before that, and that keeping it wound was a way of keeping time honest. When David died in the rain on Route 9 on a Tuesday in November, the watch stopped. Margaret wound it again and had it serviced every year afterward, keeping it running as though keeping it running kept something of David alive. When Margaret died, Claire had asked William Sterling if she could have it before the formal inventory was completed. It was the only thing she asked for. Over the 4 days leading up to the birthday party, while Nathan planned and strategized and practiced his expansion announcement, Claire took the watch to a master horologist named George in the West Village, a quiet man of about 70, who worked alone in a shop not much larger than a generous closet, and who had restored timepieces for institutions including the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She paid for the restoration with her own salary. She watched George work for an afternoon, explaining the watch's history while he examined the mechanism under magnification. And when the work was done, she had 3 words engraved on the back of the case in careful script. The engraving read, "Time given freely." It was something David Reynolds used to say. The full version was, "Time given freely is the only currency that cannot be taken back." He said it when people thanked him for showing up for things, for being present, for choosing to be somewhere when he could have been somewhere else. He said it meant that money could be earned again, but that time, once spent, was permanently gone, and that the only dignified way to spend it was deliberately. Claire wrapped the restored watch in brown paper and tied it with a cotton ribbon and set it on the dresser in their bedroom. She had made herself a private promise. If Nathan opened the watch and understood what it was, if he held it and asked about the engraving, asked about her father, asked about the family she came from and the grief she still carried, she would sit him down that night and tell him everything. About Margaret, about the inheritance, about the $47 billion waiting behind the ordinary life she had spent 31 years building around herself like a shelter. She would give him one final chance to show her that the man who had kept her notepad sketch was still there. She had learned from her grandmother that patience is not weakness, that waiting to be certain is not cowardice. But she had also learned something Margaret never said aloud but demonstrated through the way she died, that at some point, waiting becomes its own kind of waste, and the only honest thing left to do is to find out the truth and live with what you find. 4 days before the party, Claire was ready to find out. The Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom, on a Saturday night in October, looked like a stage set for a particular kind of American dream. Chandeliers dimmed to warm gold, ice sculptures in the shapes of the company logo, a stylized H positioned at either end of the room and already beginning to lose their edges in the warmth of 200 bodies. A string quartet in the corner playing pieces selected to suggest elegance without demanding attention. Towers of champagne glasses reflecting light in patterns that shifted when anyone walked past. The guest list read like an inventory of the city's ambitious and arrived. 3 venture capital firms, 2 city council members, a former NFL quarterback who had invested in Nathan's company during the Series A round and had been quietly doubling his stake ever since. Minor celebrities who knew someone who knew Nathan. Financial journalists who had come for the rumored announcement, and Victoria Blake, in a gown the color of champagne, which was not a coincidence. Claire arrived at 8:15, 30 minutes after the party officially began, and found the room already at full volume. Nathan met her near the entrance. He kissed her cheek in the distracted way of a man crossing an item off a list rather than greeting a person he loves. He introduced her to a man whose name she immediately forgot. Then he said, "Mingle, you'll be fine," and walked back toward the center of the room, toward Victoria. Claire watched this happen. She took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. She had not had alcohol since the pregnancy began, and found a position near the edge of the room where she could see most of the space without being particularly visible herself. She had learned, in 31 years of navigating rooms, where she was simultaneously the most significant and least recognized person present, how to become nearly invisible in a crowd, not through hunching or shrinking, through stillness, through the particular quality of attention that does not draw attention back to itself. She watched Nathan work the room with the fluency of someone born for it. He moved from cluster to cluster with the timing of a professional, knowing exactly how long to stay in each conversation before the energy peaked and began to plateau, extracting himself always at the moment that left the other person wanting more. It was genuinely impressive. It had been one of the things she admired about him. She watched Victoria Blake's hand find Nathan's forearm at every opportunity, with the casual ease of someone demonstrating a property right. She watched the photographer capture them together once near the entrance, once near the gift table, and Nathan did not step back either time. And Claire felt something she had been avoiding feeling for months settle quietly into place. Not anger, not grief. Those would come later. What she felt was clarity. The same sensation she felt when she placed a piece of jewelry under magnification and the maker's mark came into focus. Clean, unambiguous, final. She knew what she was looking at. She had known for some time. She simply had not been willing to stop hoping she was wrong. The evening moved forward. The string quartet took a break and a jazz singer performed 3 songs. The ice sculptures continued their slow surrender to the warmth of the room. A cluster of investors near the bar debated the projected returns on a real estate technology platform with the passionate conviction of people who have never been wrong about anything. Nobody spoke to Claire for 45 minutes. A woman passed her and smiled absently, the smile of someone cataloging people by category, filing Claire under, not relevant to my evening, and moving on. Claire remained where she was. Her hand rested occasionally on her stomach. The baby was quiet. It was Victoria who moved the party into its final configuration. She raised her voice above the room's ambient noise, not loudly, but precisely. with the practiced projection of someone who had spent years in rooms like this one, and said that Nathan simply had to open his gifts for everyone. "You always do it," she said. "Don't be shy. People love it." Nathan, who had consumed enough champagne to feel invincible and not enough to feel reckless, agreed immediately. He called for the room's attention with a tap of his champagne glass, and 200 people turned toward him with the expectant warmth of a crowd that has decided it likes you. The gifts were opened one by one, and then the room's warmth was about to be tested in a way nobody anticipated, including Nathan Hartwell himself. The gift opening process took approximately 12 minutes. Nathan worked through the table with theatrical appreciation, holding each item up for the room, naming the givers, offering specific compliments that demonstrated he had read the room's values correctly. The $40,000 watch. He held it up, and the room read the price tag and appreciated it correctly. The Super Bowl tickets. He named the game, named the teams, and half the room cheered. The modern art piece. He made a joke about not understanding it that landed perfectly because the artist was obscure enough that admitting confusion read as sophisticated. He was good at this. He was genuinely, technically good at it. And then he reached Claire's package. Brown paper, cotton ribbon, small, unremarkable in every physical way beside everything surrounding it. The room's energy shifted before Nathan even picked it up. It moved through 200 people like a current, a collective reorientation towards something that had just become interesting for reasons that were not entirely kind. Someone near the back laughed before Nathan opened it. Just a sound. A small release of something that had been building since the first extravagant gift. Nathan stared at the package for a moment. He looked across the room at Claire. And here is the moment that defined the rest of Nathan Hartwell's life, though he did not know it yet. Here is the moment that split his story into before and after. The way certain moments do. The way you can never quite see clearly until you are standing on the far side of them looking back. He had a choice. He could open the package with the same performance he had given every other gift. He could read whatever was inside with the gracious neutrality of a man who understood that gifts are gestures rather than measurements. He could be, in that moment, the person Claire had spent 17 months believing he was capable of being. He chose the other thing. He lifted the package above his head, turning it in the light, letting the room anticipate him. "Is this a joke?" he said into the microphone. His voice carried to every corner of the ballroom. The string quartet stopped playing. 7 months pregnant, and this is what you bring me. Something that looks like it came out of a yard sale. The watch fell from the box. He had not dropped it carefully. He had simply stopped holding it. It hit the marble floor at an angle, landing on its glass face, which split with a sound that was disproportionately loud in the sudden quiet. A spiderweb of cracks across the white face, the black numerals visible through the damage. Then Victoria Blake laughed. Her laugh was the key that unlocked the room. It gave everyone permission. And 200 people, most of whom had not been watching closely enough to understand what the package contained, laughed because the woman beside the man of the hour had laughed, and because laughter in a crowd is contagious in ways that individual cruelty is not. Some of them held their phones up. Some of them looked away. Most of them laughed. Nathan was not finished. "This is the best you can do." His voice was still in the microphone, still reaching every corner. "Victoria over there spent more on the flowers on this table than you spent on this." He gestured toward Victoria without looking at her. The casual gesture of someone naming a fact rather than making a comparison. "I am standing here trying to build something real, something significant, and my own wife brings me something from a pawn shop." 200 people heard him say it, every word. Claire heard him say it. She stood near the pillar where she had positioned herself earlier in the evening. She was very still. Her hands were on her stomach, both of them, in the instinctive protective gesture of a woman who has spent 7 months learning to feel another person's heartbeat through her own skin. And the baby kicked, hard, once, unmistakable, as though the baby knew. What happened next is the part of this story that people who were present that night described differently depending on who they are and what they were paying attention to. Some people say Claire walked quickly. Some say she moved slowly, almost formally. What they agree on is the quality of her movement. Straight spine, level head, no hurry in it. The movement of someone who has made a decision they are entirely at peace with. She walked to the center of the ballroom floor, past the guests, who parted slightly and went quiet, past the photographer, who had stopped taking pictures, past Victoria Blake, who stopped smiling. Claire crouched carefully, at 7 months pregnant, and picked up her father's broken watch from the marble floor. She cradled it in both hands, the way Margaret had taught her to hold fragile things. She rose. She looked at Nathan, directly, without performance. And she said, in a voice that was not raised and was not tearful and was not uncertain, in a voice that carried anyway, because the room had gone completely silent by the time she opened her mouth. I came here tonight because I still believed you were the man I married. She placed her father's watch in her evening bag. Thank you for making sure I won't make that mistake again. She turned. She walked to the ballroom doors. She pushed them open herself and stepped through. Outside on the hotel steps, the October air was cool and clean in a way that the ballroom had not been. Claire stood at the top of the steps and breathed. She felt, to her own surprise, relief, not happiness, not triumph. Just the particular relief of someone who has been holding a position under fire for a very long time and has finally been given permission to put it down. She pulled her phone from her evening bag to call Rebecca. That was when the town cars pulled up. 3 black town cars, arriving simultaneously from different directions and stopping in a coordinated line at the hotel's entrance. The drivers did not get out. The back doors opened. The man who stepped from the first car was William Sterling. William Sterling was 63 years old and had the appearance of a man who had spent every one of those years preparing to be taken seriously. Silver hair kept precisely, a dark suit that acknowledged the occasion without performing it. The particular calm of someone who has delivered consequential news in consequential rooms so many times that urgency no longer needs to announce itself through his face or voice. He walked up the steps toward Claire and stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized from the week Margaret died. The expression of a man who cares about the person he is speaking to and knows what he is about to say will change something for them. I have been trying to reach you for 2 hours, he said. My phone was on silent, Claire said. William, what is...
The Reynolds estate cleared federal probate at 11:47 tonight.
William Sterling said. The legal transfer is complete. As of this moment, you are the sole and unconditional owner of everything Margaret built. Every property, every fund, every board seat, every account, all of it. $47 billion. Effective tonight. Claire stared at him. Tonight, she said. It was not quite a question. Tonight, he confirmed. For one moment, a single suspended moment on the steps of the Grand Meridian Hotel. With the distant sound of the string quartet starting up again behind the closed ballroom doors, Claire felt something genuinely lift. She thought, I have options. Real options. I can protect myself. I can protect the baby. I can walk away from this with enough resources to build whatever comes next without asking anyone's permission or waiting for anyone's help. She almost smiled. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Douglas Crane, Nathan's attorney. She had never had a reason to have Douglas Crane's number in her phone before tonight. She had it because William had insisted she document all of Nathan's professional contacts after the Series B documents arrived at their apartment with provisions she had not been consulted on. She answered. Douglas Crane was brisk and professional and used the particular flattened tone of someone delivering bad news they have been professionally trained not to attach emotion to. Mrs. Hartwell, this is Douglas Crane representing Nathan Hartwell, Mr. Hartwell is concerned about the welfare of the unborn child given the events of this evening and what appears to be Mrs. Hartwell's significant emotional distress, Mr. Hartwell's office will be filing for a temporary custody arrangement to ensure the child's well-being during what may become a contentious separation period. Additionally, given the recently publicized information regarding Mrs. Hartwell's financial circumstances, Claire hung up. She looked at William Sterling. He knows, she said, about the estate. William's expression did not change, but something behind it did. The probate court filing became accessible through public records approximately 40 minutes ago, he said quietly. Someone notified him. I tried to reach you the moment I saw it. Claire stood on the steps of the Grand Meridian Hotel in the October night, her father's broken watch in her bag, a $47 billion inheritance now legally in her name, and her husband of 16 months already on the phone with attorneys before he had sent a single text asking whether she was all right. She felt the weight of what that last fact meant. She had spent 17 months trying to determine whether Nathan Hartwell was the man she hoped he was. She had given him every opportunity she could engineer. She had watched carefully and waited patiently and held her most valuable truth back until she was certain. She was certain now. William, she said, we need to go back inside. He nodded once. The nod of a man who had been hoping she would say exactly that. The ballroom doors opened again. And the evening, which Nathan Hartwell had planned down to the lighting cues and the champagne selection, became entirely something else. William Sterling walked to the center of the room and spoke in the tone that needed no microphone. I apologize for the interruption. I am here on behalf of the Reynolds estate. For anyone present who may be wondering, the woman who was publicly humiliated in this room approximately 30 minutes ago is Claire Reynolds Hartwell, the sole heir to Margaret Reynolds, founder of Reynolds Capital Group, the Reynolds Foundation, and a privately held portfolio of real estate and private equity interests currently valued at $47 billion. The estate transferred to Ms. Hartwell officially this evening. I thought the guests present tonight deserved that information. The room did not make a sound, not one sound. And then William opened the second document in his leather folio, the one nobody was expecting. During the mandatory financial audit required for an estate transfer of this scale, our team reviewed all Reynolds Foundation grant activity for the past 12 years. Among the recipients, Hartwell and Associates LLC, which received a $200,000 small business development grant in the spring of 2019, approved personally by Margaret Reynolds. Nathan went very still. Mr. Hartwell applied under his company's original registered name. The Reynolds Foundation did not carry the family name in its public-facing identity at that time. However, Mr. Hartwell's application listed familiarity with the foundation's work and its founding family as part of his qualification statement. He was aware of the Reynolds name. He applied directly to a fund connected to that family. And in 16 months of marriage to Margaret Reynolds' only grandchild, he never once disclosed this connection to his wife. The room had already been silent. What followed was something beyond silence. It was the particular stillness of 200 people simultaneously revising their understanding of an evening they thought they had already understood. The investor who had laughed loudest at the watch set his phone down slowly on a table as though it had become heavy. The venture capitalist who had filmed the gift opening reached into his pocket and deleted it while looking at his own shoes. Victoria Blake, who had been standing close to Nathan all evening, took one careful step backward, and Nathan Hartwell stood in the center of the room he had rented and decorated and filled with the people he most wanted to impress, and understood for the first time in his adult life what it felt like to be the person everyone in the room was looking at for exactly the wrong reasons. He had built his self-made story, his pitch decks, his keynote speeches, his public identity as a man who had built something from nothing on a foundation grant from Claire's grandmother. He had been financially connected to the Reynolds family for 6 years. He had never told Claire. Before anyone in the room found words, Victoria Blake spoke. Her voice was flat, final. "Nathan, stop talking." She turned to face the room, and her expression had shifted into something that had abandoned strategy entirely. "I knew about the Reynolds connection," she said. "My family's attorneys identified it 8 months ago when we were reviewing the Series B term sheet. I knew Claire was the Reynolds heir. I came back into Nathan's life because I believed that if I positioned myself correctly during the estate transfer, there would be a significant opportunity." Nathan stared at her. "You were using me," he said. "We were using each other," Victoria said. "The difference between us is I never humiliated a pregnant woman in front of 200 people to do it." She picked up her evening bag and walked out. Nobody moved to stop her. Nobody said anything at all. William Sterling's legal team spent the next 45 minutes in a suite on the hotel's 16th floor, handling the preliminary response to Nathan's custody filing with the efficient and unhurried professionalism of people who have managed far more complicated situations. Rebecca Cole, who had been across town at dinner with her husband when Claire texted her 2 words, "Come now," arrived at the hotel at 12:20 and did not leave Claire's side. A physician arranged by William examined Claire at 12:30. Thorough, professional, quiet. The baby's heartbeat was strong and steady. No acute signs of distress. William told Claire that the custody filing was almost certainly a first-position negotiating tactic, something Douglas Crane would have advised as a way of establishing early leverage before any settlement discussions began. Given Claire's legal standing and resources, it would be addressed without significant difficulty. "Try to rest," William said. Claire sat in the suite with her shoes off and Rebecca beside her, and for approximately 45 minutes, she allowed herself to believe that the worst of the evening was finished, that what remained was merely difficult rather than catastrophic. She was wrong. At 12:52, while Claire was sitting with her eyes closed and Rebecca was reading something on her phone, Rebecca looked up. "Claire," she said quietly, "you need to look at something." She handed Claire the phone. The video had been uploaded at 11:52. Someone at the party later identified as a junior analyst from one of the venture capital firms, 26 years old, who would spend the following year describing the decision as the worst of his professional life, had sold 4 minutes of footage to a media aggregator for a sum that would not cover his rent for 2 months. The footage covered everything: the gift opening, Nathan's speech into the microphone, the watch hitting the floor, Claire's walk across the room, her words, her exit, William Sterling's entrance, the reading of the estate documents, Victoria's confession. It had been viewed 4 million times. Nathan's company stock, publicly traded since the IPO in July, was down 11 points in after-hours trading. His board of directors had sent a meeting request, time-stamped 12:47 in the morning. His head of communications had resigned by text message at 1:09. The international expansion Nathan had planned to announce tonight, the announcement he had built the entire evening around. The announcement he had spent 8 months positioning was being described in financial news coverage as effectively dead before it launched. Claire looked at the screen for a long time. Then the contractions started. She recognized them immediately from every prenatal class she had attended alone. Because Nathan's schedule had always made attendance difficult, she had attended every session anyway and paid careful attention to everything the instructor said because she had known. At some level she did not articulate to herself that she might need to understand these things without help. 1:23 in the morning, 8 weeks early. Rebecca had the hospital on the phone before Claire finished the second sentence. The next 4 hours moved in the suspended, disjointed way of genuine emergencies, time speeding up and slowing down without warning. Individual details acquiring strange clarity while the larger picture blurred at the edges. The ambulance, the cold air outside the hotel, the fluorescent hallways of the labor and delivery floor, the monitors and the numbers and the specific terror of watching a heartbeat displayed on a screen and not knowing if what you are looking at is strong enough. William Sterling arrived at the hospital at 2:04 in the morning and sat in the waiting area without being asked and without announcing himself. Nathan arrived at 2:17. A nurse met him at the door to Claire's room and asked, with the professional neutrality of someone who asks this question many times each shift, whether he was listed as an approved visitor. Claire had called William from the ambulance. She had made one addition to her file. Rebecca Cole was listed as an approved visitor. Nathan Hartwell was not. By 4 in the morning, the medical team had stabilized Claire completely. The contractions had slowed and spaced to intervals that were manageable. The baby's vitals on the monitor were strong, the heartbeat steady and even. Strict bed rest, the attending physician said. 4 weeks minimum. No exceptions, no negotiations. Zero stress. In the waiting room, William Sterling allowed himself to close his eyes for approximately 90 seconds. Then his phone rang. 4:15 in the morning. Douglas Crane. William answered and listened without interrupting for 45 seconds. When Crane finished speaking, William was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to make sure I understand you correctly. Nathan Hartwell has filed an emergency parental rights motion claiming that his wife's decision to designate her own visitor access during a medical emergency constitutes interference with his rights as a parent." Filed at 4:15 in the morning, while she is in a hospital bed recovering from stress-induced preterm labor following events that he caused. Crane said something. "I heard you," William said. "Now hear me. My client has received 112 media interview requests since midnight. She has declined all of them. She has done so without being asked, out of her own choice. I would like Nathan to understand that her choices are entirely her own. They are entirely within her rights, and they have an expiration point. That point is 5 o'clock this morning." He hung up. The filing was withdrawn at 4:51. Before you hear what happens next, I want to say something directly. When someone uses your most physically and emotionally vulnerable moment, a hospital room, a medical emergency, a premature birth as a legal pressure point to gain negotiating position, that is the clearest possible signal of who they actually are. It is not grief. It is not hurt. It is not love expressing itself badly under pressure. It is strategy. And you cannot save a relationship with someone who treats your worst moment as an opportunity. You can only protect yourself from them. Claire knew this by 4:51 in the morning. She had known it for hours. She had known it, perhaps, for longer than she had been willing to admit. But now she had proof that was not ambiguous, not small, not explainable, and she was done explaining. The divorce took 14 months. Claire spent the first 4 of those months on bed rest in the apartment she moved to, a quiet 2-bedroom in the West Village, 3 blocks from George the horologist's shop, which she had chosen because she found the proximity comforting in a way she did not attempt to analyze. William Sterling managed every legal dimension with the thoroughness of someone who understood that his job was not just to protect Claire's financial interests, but to create enough structural distance between Claire and Nathan that Claire could heal without being interrupted. Nathan's legal team, Douglas Crane, leading a rotating cast of expensive specialists, attempted 4 distinct arguments across 14 months. They argued that the Reynolds estate assets had been commingled with marital property during the marriage. The documentation showed they had not. They argued that Nathan had constructive knowledge of the inheritance before the marriage, that it was a shared marital asset from the beginning. The timeline of the probate proceedings contradicted this. They argued that Claire's concealment of her financial identity during their courtship and marriage constituted fraud under applicable statutes. This was the argument Douglas Crane believed in most. The presiding judge, a woman who had been on the family court bench for 22 years and who had, in her own words delivered in her written opinion, heard nearly every creative argument available to well-resourced divorce attorneys address the fraud claim directly in her ruling. She wrote, "The decision by a private individual to withhold personal financial information during courtship and early marriage does not constitute fraud under any applicable statute. If it did, we would need to criminalize the act of modesty, which has not yet been proposed." The plaintiff's claim fails. Nathan received what the prenuptial agreement signed by both parties before the inheritance became public knowledge, drafted in good faith, reviewed by independent counsel on both sides, entitled him to nothing from the Reynolds estate. His own company, which had been his before the marriage and remained his in the settlement, had lost 43% of its market value in the 6 weeks following the party. 2 of his 3 major investors withdrew their commitments within the month. The international expansion was formally abandoned in February. The London lease was never signed. The Dubai partnership agreement expired. His board of directors accepted his resignation, or accepted the resignation he offered before they had to ask for it 7 months after the party. He sold his remaining equity stake the following spring. He moved to a smaller place in Connecticut, which was either ironic or appropriate depending on how you chose to read it. Victoria Blake did not speak to Nathan Hartwell again after she walked out of the Grand Meridian Ballroom. She issued a brief statement through her family's publicist, describing herself as a business acquaintance uninvolved in the evening's events. No journalist who read it believed her. Nobody in a position to matter to her professionally was willing to say so publicly. The junior analyst who sold the footage lost his job within the week. He spent several months afterward in a state of profound regret that he described, in the one interview he gave on the subject, as genuinely educational in the worst possible way. Claire's daughter was born on a Thursday morning in December, 2 weeks before her due date, but with none of the complications the medical team had prepared for. She arrived with the particular air of someone who has taken their time making a decision and arrived fully committed once they made it. She weighed 7 pounds and 2 ounces. She was, every person in the delivery room agreed, immediately and completely herself. Claire named her Margaret. William Sterling excused himself to the hallway shortly after the announcement. He returned 3 minutes later with his tie precisely straightened and his eyes slightly red, and he did not explain either detail, and nobody asked. Rebecca Cole, who had slept in a chair in the delivery room through the entire night, held the baby for 11 minutes and then surrendered her back with the visible reluctance of someone who would have stayed all day if permitted. The birth announcement, released through the Reynolds Foundation's communications office, was 4 sentences. It noted Margaret's name, her birth date, her weight, and her health. It did not mention Nathan Hartwell. Nathan received a copy through William Sterling's office. He kept it in his desk. 2 months after Margaret was born, Nathan sent Claire a letter, 3 paragraphs. No requests, no appeals, no strategic positioning. The last paragraph said, "I kept the watch. I did not repair it. I look at it sometimes when I am tempted to let a room's opinion matter more than the truth in front of me. I know this does not help you. I am not writing because I think it helps you. I am writing because Margaret deserves a father who understands what he cost her before she is old enough to form her own opinion of it. I intend to try to be that." Claire read the letter twice. She put it in the cedar chest. She did not respond, but she did not throw it away. And if you want to know what that means, I think you already do. Some things do not require a verdict. Some things simply require that we put them somewhere safe and let time do what time does. A full year passed. The city continued its restless motion around both of them, indifferent to the private reckonings playing out within it. Manhattan in the fall became Manhattan in winter, became Manhattan in the first hesitant green of spring. And Claire Reynolds Hartwell moved through all of it with the deliberate, unhurried quality of someone who has decided that every hour belongs to her now, and she intends to use them accordingly. She had formally accepted her position as chair of the Reynolds Foundation 3 months after Margaret was born. Once the pediatrician had confirmed that the baby was thriving and the bed rest restriction had been lifted, and Claire had slept for 8 consecutive hours twice in the same week. She approached the role the way she had approached everything in her professional life, by first understanding exactly what already existed, then determining honestly where it was working and where it was not, then making changes that were deliberate rather than dramatic. Under her leadership, the foundation expanded its education initiatives into 11 additional cities over the following year. She funded scholarship programs for young artist programs that deliberately sought students from backgrounds where talent existed without infrastructure, the kind of students who reminded her of the girl she had been before any of this, certain of what she valued, uncertain whether the world would make room for it. She insisted on reading scholarship applications herself rather than delegating entirely to the selection committee. Not all of them, the volume made that impossible, but a meaningful portion each cycle, rotated so that every category of applicant had been seen by her at some point. When members of her staff asked her why she insisted on this when her time could be spent on decisions with larger organizational impact, she told them, "Because I want every applicant to know that someone with the power to change their circumstances took the time to actually see them. And you cannot guarantee that if you have never done it yourself." The Reynolds Corporation, the commercial and private equity holdings that formed the financial engine supporting the foundation's work, found new energy and direction under her quiet, careful attention. She grew it steadily rather than dramatically, favoring stability over spectacle, which made certain members of the financial press describe her as conservative, and certain members of the industry describe her as one of the shrewdest operators they had encountered. She still lived in the West Village apartment rather than a sprawling estate. She still walked when the weather permitted. She still knew the names of the interns after a single introduction. She still spoke to the janitor who cleaned the foundation's offices each evening with the same attention she gave to the museum donors who attended her quarterly board dinners. Colleagues who worked alongside her for the first time often remarked, privately, that she seemed strangely unaffected by the scale of what she managed, as though the resources had simply confirmed something that was already there, rather than creating something new. This was, of course, exactly what Margaret Reynolds had spent 50 years trying to engineer. It had worked. Nathan Hartwell, in that same year, followed a different path in a different direction. He took a smaller position at a financial consulting firm in Westport, Connecticut, where nobody recognized him from the viral footage and where the work was unglamorous enough that it could not be performed for an audience. He was not a partner. He was not a principal. He was a senior analyst, the same title he had held at 30, and which he had spent the following 5 years outrunning. He was learning, at 35, what it felt like to do work without the accompaniment of other people's admiration. He found it, in ways he had not expected, something close to honest. He began volunteering on Saturday mornings at a community center near his apartment. Financial literacy classes for adults returning to the workforce after long gaps, people who needed to understand credit and savings and tax basics and were embarrassed about not knowing them. He taught the classes without using his name as a credential. He was just the guy who came in on Saturday mornings, week after week, who knew about money and was willing to explain it without making anyone feel foolish for not already knowing. He was, everyone who attended agreed, very good at it. He thought about Claire sometimes. He thought about Margaret, his daughter, who would be a year old in December, who he saw on the alternating weekends the custody arrangement provided, who had her mother's dark hair and a personality that was entirely, completely her own. He thought about the watch in his desk drawer. He still had not repaired it. He had come to understand that the broken watch was more useful to him broken. It reminded him, every time he saw it, of the exact moment he had chosen a room full of strangers over the woman who loved him. He needed that reminder. He needed it frequently. That is what real consequences look like. Not punishment, just the permanent, honest weight of understanding exactly what a choice cost and carrying that understanding forward. Claire and Nathan's paths crossed one more time before the first year was over. A spring evening at an art opening, one of the smaller galleries on the Lower East Side that the Reynolds Foundation now quietly supported alongside its larger institutional grants. Ethan had attended at the invitation of a former colleague. He had not known Claire would be there until he saw her across the room. She was standing in front of a painting, a large abstract piece in blues and greens that suggested water without depicting it with the quiet, concentrated stillness she used to bring to her work at the auction house. Margaret was not with her. It was an adult's evening. She looked, Nathan thought, like someone who had arrived somewhere. Not somewhere specific, somewhere internal. A place you reach after a long and difficult journey when you finally stop expecting the journey to continue and simply allow yourself to have arrived. She noticed him a moment later. What passed between them was not warmth and not hostility. It was something more precise than either. The particular recognition of two people who have survived the same difficult chapter and emerged as substantially different people, and know this about each other without needing to discuss it. Nathan did not cross the room. Claire offered a small, courteous nod, the kind extended to any acquaintance from a previous chapter of a life that has since moved on, and Nathan returned it. Nothing more. Neither of them needed anything more. After a few minutes, Claire turned back to the painting on the wall. Nathan found his colleague and stayed for another 40 minutes on the other side of the room, and then left first, which felt like the right thing to do. Outside on the spring sidewalk, he stood for a moment. He thought about what William Sterling had told him in the waiting room of the hospital at 5 in the morning, before driving away without waiting for a response, that some doors, once closed, are not designed to reopen, no matter how sincerely a person approaches them. He understood that now in a way he had not understood it then. He put his hands in his pockets and walked toward the subway. In the gallery, Claire finished her walk through the exhibition, spoke briefly to the gallery owner, thanked the Foundation's program officer for organizing the evening, and stepped outside into the mild spring air. A car was waiting. She sat in the back and looked out the window as the gallery disappeared behind her. And she thought about Margaret, her grandmother, not her daughter, though the two had begun to blend in her mind in a way she found comforting. She thought about the kitchen table in the brownstone, the bowl of soup, the conversation she had been 12 years old for and had been understanding more fully every year since. She reached into her jacket pocket. The watch was there. She had carried it every day since George completed the second restoration, the one she had commissioned the week after Margaret was born. The glass face was new. The mechanism ran with the same precise sweep it had run with when her father carried it. The engraving on the back was unchanged. Time given freely. She turned it over in her hands. It was the most valuable object she owned. Not because of what it was worth, which was nothing, by the standard of her inheritance, but because of what it represented, and what it had survived, and what it continued to mean. Her father had believed that the only currency that cannot be taken back is time given freely. That money could be earned again, rebuilt again, lost and recovered and lost again. But that time, once spent, was permanently gone, and that the only dignified way to spend it was on things and people that were genuinely worth it. Margaret Reynolds had believed the same thing, in her own version of the same language, and had spent 50 years demonstrating it in the particular way that the Reynolds family seemed to demonstrate everything, quietly, consistently, and entirely without need for an audience. Claire closed her hand around the watch. She thought, I understand now what they were both trying to tell me. Not just about money, about everything. The car moved through the spring streets of Manhattan, past the lit windows and the sidewalk cafes and the people walking dogs and the delivery cyclists and the infinite ordinary motion of a city that does not pause for any single person's reckoning. And here is the thing about Claire Reynolds Hartwell. 1 year after the night in the Grand Meridian Ballroom, she was not angry. She was not bitter. She was not defined by what had been done to her in that ballroom, or by the inheritance, or by the marriage, or by the footage that had circled the globe, or by any single thing that had happened to her. She was defined by what she had built, and she was still building. 3 weeks after the art opening, on a bright Tuesday morning in late May, Claire stood at a podium at the groundbreaking of the Margaret Reynolds Children's Medical Center in rural Appalachian, Ohio, a county where the nearest hospital had been 47 miles away and where preventable childhood illnesses had been producing outcomes that belonged to a different century. The foundation had been developing the project for 8 months. Claire had been involved in every significant decision. She was wearing a cream blazer over a simple white shirt, her daughter 14 months old. Solid and determinedly curious about everything within arm's reach was on her left hip. The watch was in her jacket pocket. The crowd gathered on the construction site was not the crowd in the Grand Meridian Ballroom. There were construction workers in hard hats, nurses from the county clinic being replaced by this building, local families, the county superintendent of schools, a state senator who had been skeptical of the project until the funding was confirmed and was now enthusiastically supportive, a handful of journalists who had been told in advance that questions about anything prior to the current year would not be answered. Claire looked out at them. She spoke without notes. My grandmother used to say that the true measure of wealth is not what you accumulate. It is what you build for people who needed something to exist before you thought to build it. She spent 50 years proving that. She did it quietly, without a great deal of credit, and without appearing to need the credit. She did it because she understood something that I am still learning how to fully embody, that having resources is not an accomplishment. It is a responsibility. What you do with them is the part that matters. She paused. Margaret, her daughter, 14 months old, solid and warm and entirely herself, reached up with one small fist and grabbed the lapel of Claire's cream blazer. Claire looked down at her, and she smiled. Not the smile for cameras. Not the smile of a woman performing composure for an audience. The other kind. The smile that comes from somewhere that has nothing to do with being watched. This is what comes next, Claire said. For all of us. The groundbreaking ceremony lasted 40 minutes. Claire shook every hand offered to her. She learned the names of the construction foreman and the lead engineer and the county health administrator who had spent 3 years advocating for this project before the foundation came aboard. She did not rush any of it. Afterward, in the car on the way to the airport, with Margaret asleep against her shoulder and the Ohio landscape moving past the window in the afternoon light, Claire thought about what it meant to have arrived at this particular version of her life. She had not planned it this way. She had not planned any of it. Not the inheritance. Not Nathan. Not the party. Not the night that remade everything. She had planned to live carefully, to love honestly, and to eventually build something that justified the extraordinary resources she had been entrusted with. 2 of those 3 things had gone exactly as she intended. The third had gone wrong in ways that had cost her more than she had words for. But here is what she understood. On the far side of it, the cost had not changed who she was, and no cost ever would. Because who she was had been decided long before any of this at a kitchen table in a brownstone in Manhattan, over bowls of soup. In a conversation with a woman who had spent 50 years trying to teach her granddaughter the only thing that actually matters, that the true measure of a person is not what they have. It is how they treat someone standing in front of them before they know anything about what that person might someday become. And it is how they carry themselves when they are the person being tested. Claire Reynolds Hartwell had been tested in front of 200 people. She had carried herself well. That was not the inheritance. That was the lesson. And it was the one thing in her life that had never, not once, been at risk. If this story has stayed with you, if any part of it felt familiar, if any moment in it reflected something you have lived or watched someone close to you live, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment below. Tell me which moment hit you hardest. And if someone in your life needed to hear this today, share it with them. You don't need to explain why. The right story usually explains itself. Take care of yourselves. I will see you in the next one.